Good evening, everyone. By way of quick summary of the last couple of lessons, in lesson 1 we showed how, despite the fact that there's still a great deal wrong with the world, it is progressing. It's getting closer to the fulfillment of those ancient biblical prophecies that concerned health and all the social conditions. And we were able to show that in the last couple of decades, the pace of innovation has been speeding up exponentially, and the world is creeping towards a greater perfection. Not everybody is completely persuaded about that, but there are certainly amazing advancements in many, many fields, even if they're not equally distributed across the planet. In lesson 2, we asked the question as to why, if God wanted a perfect world, why didn't he create it perfect from the outset? Why does the world need to go through this painful process of improvement? And this led us to a further question, and perhaps the biggest question of all for any religious person. And as I said, not a question that a person who doesn't believe in God ever needs to ask, but if one is a believer in God and that he created the universe, why did God create the world in the first place? What's the purpose of it? And after a lengthy discussion about the process of creation from a kind of theological, Kabbalistic perspective, we arrived at the counterintuitive conclusion that the perfect God actually wanted an imperfect world, because he wanted human beings to create in inverted commas, a home for him in the world, which we haven't defined yet. That is to say, to turn the world from a state of imperfection into one of perfection. He wanted what we call the light that comes from the darkness, which is more intense than light without darkness. In a certain sense, it occurs to me that this answer of the Kabbalists as to why the world was created actually makes a lot of sense for a religious person. Because a person who believes in a beneficent, caring God is faced with a very fundamental question about the world. How to reconcile that belief with the rotten world filled with cruelty, corruption, inequality, and disease that we see before our eyes? How do you square that circle? And so the suggestion that God created it that way so that we could change it for the better and eliminate all of its fatal flaws has a certain compelling rationale by way of an answer. So that's by way of summary for the last couple of weeks. And before we begin the next step in our exploration of this whole Mashiach concept, we're going to do a little exercise that's going to help to frame the discussion that we're going to have tonight. And that is exercise 3.1 in your workbooks on page 97. The question, why do you do a mitzvah? You don't have to answer it, but you just have to look at it, because we're going to come back to it a little bit later and ask yourself the question, is it because God said so? Is it because you makes your life more orderly and stable? Maybe it strengthens your Jewish identity. It just feels right. It makes the world a better place. You believe you're going to be rewarded for it. You're afraid to disobey God, or any other kind of reason that you might want to come up with. When you do something which is not just a good deed, but you perform a mitzvah, why? But for the moment, we are going to digress, because we've discussed before the principle of reward and punishment. The idea that there are consequences to our actions. And that's one of the foundations of Judaism that we've discussed in the previous courses. And the Torah contains many passages promising that our positive actions will be rewarded. And for example, on page 98 in text number 1, it comes from the second paragraph of the Shema, and it's quite explicit. Marilyn, why didn't you read this one for us, since you've just joined us? You're muted at the moment, so you just need to unmute.
Unmute.
Okay.
Yeah. Am I on? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. No good deed goes unrewarded. That's not what I always hear, but still. If you follow my statutes and keep my commandments and observe them, I will provide your rains in their proper time. The earth will give its produce, and the trees of the field will yield their fruits.
Thank you. So we would normally think of these rewards as a kind of a prize or a payment for good behavior. When you obey God and you follow his instructions, you'll get rewarded, hopefully with health or prosperity in this world, and hopefully the delights of Gan Eden in the next world, and ultimately the Messiah in the world to come. That's kind of like the conception with which people would start in a simplistic way. And the following text, in addition to summarizing what we learned last week, sets the stage for the topic of today's lesson. It's going to add a new layer of insight into our understanding of this whole concept of reward and punishment that we have not looked at in depth before. So first of all, what have we learnt about in the previous lessons? Number one, the Messianic world is the ultimate state of perfection. Number two, the Messianic era is characterized by all sorts of material achievements, as we saw in lesson number one, and that the root cause of flaws and imperfections in our world, as we discussed last week, is the concealment that obscures the underlying divine reality, and revealing the true nature of existence brings to light the intrinsic goodness and perfection that underlies reality. And that's the process that the book of Tanya terms making a home for God in this lowly world, terms which are familiar to us from last week's lesson. And we've also learned that improvements in the world are achieved through our actions and work throughout the duration of this long exile, as we bring more spirituality into the world through our performance of mitzvot. So what is the additional insight that we gain tonight? And the answer is in text number 2 on page 99. And it's a very short text. But if somebody would start to read it, please. The result of our mitzvot. Taken once again from the book of Tanya. Thank you. Please go. Just unmute first. Somebody reading it? Okay, I'll read it.
I'll read it.
Okay, please, go ahead. Text number 2.
This ultimate perfection of the age of Mashiach and the resurrection, namely the revelation of the infinite radiance of God in this physical world, depends on our actions and our work throughout the duration of exile. For the reward of a mitzvah is the result of the mitzvah itself. This is because, with the performance of a mitzvah, one elicits God's infinite radiance so that it descends into and is integrated within the physical matter of this world.
Thank you. So the new point that comes out in this passage over here is this statement: the reward of a mitzvah is the result of the mitzvah itself. Now, that's a bit of a brain twister, isn't it? I mean, what does that mean? Well, what the book of Tanya, what the author is doing, is he is making a distinction, an important distinction between a reward and a result. Reward, result. Let's explain it. Consider the two following scenarios. Scenario A. I work for 20 years in a sneaker factory, making sneakers and saving up enough money to buy a house. Eventually I buy a house with the money that I've earned. The house is a reward for my hard work and industry. Scenario B. I obtain timber and bricks and other materials and build a house. The house is the result of my work. Reward and result are different concepts. Now, if you apply this distinction to the performance of commandments, the act of doing a mitzvah, what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is teaching over here, the act of doing a mitzvah is not just a good deed for which, at some later stage, we will receive a reward, which may not be directly related to the mitzvah itself. Just like, if you are a good boy and go to Cheder, Mummy and I will take you to Disneyland. There's no connection between going to Cheder and Disneyland, but the one is clearly a reward for the other. But rather, what he's saying over here is that the performance of the act creates the home for God. It fashions another piece of our lives or of the world into a component of God's home in this world, in the same way that each brick in the house that I build becomes a component in the overall complete building. And in this respect, the reward of a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. Well, we've used the phrase home for God in the lowly world many times in the past sessions, and we first encountered it in the book of Tanya. But the question is, what does it actually mean? Last week we looked at the concept of lowly, but tonight we ask, what does it mean to make a home for God? Especially if, as we said in the last lesson last week, God is equally present everywhere. So in what sense do we make a home for him? Well, last week when we discussed the various worlds and the chain reaction of creation, the feature that distinguished them one from the other was not how present or absent God is, but to what extent is the presence of God revealed or concealed. And that gives us a clue to what a home is. If I were to ask you this question, what is the difference between your home and all the other places that you spend time in the course of your life? In shops, in offices, in public places, as a guest in somebody else's home. What is the defining difference between all of those experiences? And the answer is because when you're not in your home, you need to constrain yourself in some way to conform to a certain role or a certain code of behavior that is imposed by that environment. When you're in somebody else's home, you behave yourself. You don't walk around like a schlump because it's not your space. You're respectful of the other person. You don't just walk into the kitchen and help yourself to whatever you want. The point about being at home is that it is the one single environment where we are fully ourselves, completely at ease. A home for God, therefore, means a place where godliness is revealed and expressed rather than concealed and suppressed. In our home, we're fully ourselves. It's a nice little slide that depicts that. This kid has no inhibitions. He's flying his plane, doing it whichever way he wants. He's in his own imaginary world because he's in his own room, in his own space, in his own world. And we have to try and create a home for God in the same way. The whole idea of concealment and revelation is best explained by way of an analogy. And I'm going to show you a picture. And here it is. I think everybody knows what they're looking at. It's called Object A. Okay? But before you all shout out what you're looking at, we're going to do a little thought experiment. Okay? Imagine that there are 3 parallel universes. Universe 1 is our world. Universe 2 is exactly like our world, but with one difference. There is no music in this world. There's never been music in this world. In the entire history, no one in the world in Universe 2 has ever heard or played a piece of music. And Universe 3 has no human beings in it. It is entirely populated by woodpeckers. Okay? Now, place object A that you see in this slide in Universe 1. A person walks by and says, "Wow, what a beautiful piano." A musician walks by, sits down, and plays his or her favorite composition. And a whole crowd of people gathers around to listen. That's Universe 1. Now, place object A in Universe 2. If you ask the people in this universe what they see, they will probably recognize this object A as an exquisitely fashioned piece, a very unusually fashioned piece of furniture. Perhaps it's a table of some sort, although they might wonder at its very strange shape. They'll put a vase of flowers on it, or maybe a bunch of framed photographs, which, by the way, in a lot of homes I've been into, seems to be the primary function of object A in any event. But the more technically minded will start to take it apart, and they'll come to the conclusion that it is an instrument of some sort, but it'll be a mystery to them as to what it is. They simply won't know, because they've never heard music. So there's object A with a vase on it. Now let's see this object A in Universe 3. To the inhabitants of Universe 3, this is a splendid piece of wood. And they'll climb all over it and start pecking. The point is this: object A is the same object in all three worlds. It's equally present in all three worlds. The difference between the worlds is only one of awareness and perception. But this difference is very, very significant, because the limited awareness of Universe 2 obscures the object's true nature. It reduces its revealed function from a musical instrument to a piece of furniture, for goodness sake. And in the even greater concealment of Universe 3, its revealed function is even further reduced to a piece of wood. So let's suggest then, as we take this analogy, that our world is like a piano, and we can experience it like a flock of woodpeckers, blind to everything else other than its most physical and materialistic aspect. And so we peck at it and destroy it in the process, in search of some tasty morsel that we believe we can extract from this universe for our purposes. Or perhaps we're a bit more sophisticated than that. Perhaps our intellectual sensitivities have raised us a step above our most materialistic mode of existence to perhaps a more elevated perception of reality, and we look at the world and we recognize it as an exquisitely designed instrument. Our existence has become more spiritual. We understand that there must be more to life than just mere existence and self-perpetuation. But we're still groping in the dark, because the true purpose of our existence remains hidden from us. Finally, we could learn to play the piano. We could learn to experience the world for what it truly is: an instrument through which God chooses to express his goodness and perfection. So the mitzvot are the tools that are given to us to help us to penetrate the layers of concealment and to reveal and to actualize the true nature and the function of our existence. The question is, how? Text number 3 on page 101. Someone to read, please.
I don't mind reading.
Thank you very much.
Through parchment of fruit and money, through the performance of a mitzvah, a person causes a flood of God's infinite light to descend from above and be enclosed within the corporeality of the world, within an object that was previously under the dominion of and whose existence depended upon the spiritual forces that obscure the godly reality. This includes all things that are kosher and permissible with which a mitzvah is then performed. For example, the parchment used in tefillin, a mezuzah or a Torah scroll, an etrog, citron, so long as it is not olav, fruit from a tree's first 3 years, which are biblically prescribed, money given to charity, so long as it has not been dishonestly acquired, and similarly with other material things. When one uses these objects to perform God's mitzvah, and therefore fulfill his expressed desire, their vivifying force ascends and is absorbed within God's infinite light.
Well, as always, the text is dense and doesn't make sense as we read it at first, and our task is to unpack it and to make it more sensible. What we are saying here is that, more specifically, a mitzvah, as we begin to analyze it and deconstruct it, functions in two primary ways. The first is described in text number 4 on page 104. So, Sue, would you mind just continuing to read that, please? On page 104, text number 4. There are two aspects to every mitzvah. Or someone else, don't mind, anyone.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Okay.
Sorry, I was speaking.
Okay.
The dual function of a mitzvah. There are two aspects to every mitzvah. One aspect is the fact that with every mitzvah that we do, we fulfill God's will. In this regard, there is no difference between one mitzvah and the next. An individual fulfills a mitzvah not because of its unique qualities and its unique effects, but simply to carry out God's will. This aspect of the mitzvah is aptly demonstrated in the observation of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, Likutei Torah Shlach.
Okay, good. It's all right, carry on.
That if we were commanded to chop wood, we would do it in obedience to the divine will with the same enthusiasm as we fulfill the mitzvah of tefillin. The second aspect of a mitzvah is that each mitzvah brings a spiritual refinement to the individual performing the mitzvah. Similarly, the mitzvah brings a spiritual refinement to the objects with which it is performed and ultimately refines the world. The difference between these two elements is that with the first aspect, the specifics of the mitzvah are irrelevant. All mitzvot are equal, for they are all equally God's will. By contrast, the second element highlights the significance of each mitzvah's specific details, for each mitzvah brings it a similar branch of spiritual enhancement to the soul, and it refines the world in a different way.
Thank you very much, Silo. So let's explain that. First of all, I'll show you this next slide over here, function A. Function B, there are two aspects to a mitzvah. One is the general fulfillment of God's will, and the other is the specific spiritual refinement. Well, let's get into that. So, starting with the first function. As we discussed in the previous lesson, the nature of the concealment in this world, and the reason why it is called the lowliest world, is because it doesn't possess a sense of connection with or any sense of dependence upon the divine force that creates it and gives it its life force. It has a sense of self-sufficiency and independence, as we've previously discussed. Not only does the physical world see itself as an existence other than God, but as we've discussed before, it even perceives itself as independent of its creator, free even to disobey God, to deny his existence, if you wish. And unlike the higher spiritual worlds, which at the very least recognize that they exist to serve a purpose beyond their own existence, the sensibility that the physical reality engenders is one that sees its own self-perpetuation, its own self-enhancement as a sufficient purpose for its own existence and for everything else. So, what happens when we do a mitzvah? A mitzvah means a command. It's an expression of divine will. God chooses to designate a particular action to constitute the fulfillment of his will. If you do thus and thus, you will do what I want. But now we have a big problem, because we have a clash of wills. I may not want to do what God wants me to do. I have other plans for my life. And then I put aside my own will and I do God's will. In that moment, in the act of performing the mitzvah, both I and the object of the resource with which the mitzvah has been performed become an instrument of the divine will. Because in doing this act, I demonstrate that my own existence is not an end in itself. I subjugate myself to a higher end. The physical resources that I own and control aren't just there for me to use as I see fit. Rather, I utilize these resources to fulfill a divine command. And in this respect, what the author is saying to us in this passage is that in this respect, every mitzvah is the same. Reciting a prayer or doing groceries for your mum may be two very different actions and two very different types of experiences. The first is spiritual and emotional. The second is physical and, frankly, sometimes tedious. But they have one thing in common. With both actions, you are following God's will, as expressed in his commandments. Prayer, on the one hand, and honoring one's parent on the other. So you're making your life an instrument of God's will. The second function takes us to a different concept altogether. The second way that a mitzvah makes a home for God is by refining and elevating the particular piece of the world with which the mitzvah is being done. The piece of the world, so to speak, may be a physical object, a trait within your character, a talent that you have, a natural resource, a cultural phenomenon, etc. If you're saying a prayer, you're moving lips, the prayer book, the emotions that you feel are being engaged. If you're shopping for your mother, then your patience while waiting in the line at the checkout counter and the physical effort of schlepping the bags are involved in the action. In both cases, there are parts of yourself and of your world, your environment, that are engaged in this process and are becoming refined, that is to say, more attuned to their own inherent goodness and holiness. Because a person who lives a coarse life and engages in coarse things will become coarse. I love that statement of Abraham Lincoln, who once said that a man over the age of 40 is responsible for his face. A person who lives a refined life and does refined things will become refined. A person who performs a mitzvah with a physical object in which the divine energy that vivifies it is at this moment concealed, at some spiritual level reveals the innate godliness that resides within that object, and in the process that object becomes refined even if we don't have the receptors to sense the change that is happening in that object. And in regard to this second function of a mitzvah, every mitzvah therefore is different, because each mitzvah will engage a different part of our personality, a different area of our lives, a different area of the world. Observing Shabbat, for example, instills in us the awareness that the world has a creator and a purpose, and Shabbat prevents us from being consumed by our job and our career. On the other hand, the laws of family purity and mikvah refine our sexual lives, ensuring that we treat our spouses in a nice way rather than just an object of desire. The mitzvah of charity cultivates our compassion for others, our sense of communal responsibility. And it's in regard to this aspect of the mitzvah that our sages declare, as you'll see in text number 5 on page 105, does God truly mind if a person slaughters an animal from the throat or slaughters it from the back of the neck? Rather, the mitzvot, says the Midrash, were given only to refine the individuals who perform it, to have the sensitivity to know that you're taking the life of an animal in the most painless possible way. Because the mitzvah of shechita dictates that if we want to eat meat, the animal must be slaughtered in a specific way. In regard to the first function of the mitzvah, that we should simply implement the divine will in our lives, it would make no difference what God would command us to do. Only the fact that there is a command, an opportunity to fulfill a divine desire, that's all that's significant. But regarding this second function of the mitzvah, to refine the person, the specifics definitely matter. The Torah commands that the animal must be slaughtered in a humane way to eliminate the trait of cruelty from our hearts, to ensure that our consumption of food is undertaken with mindfulness, with sensitivity. And it's because of this second function that there are so many mitzvot, covering every area of our lives. To serve the first function of a mitzvah, the truth of the matter is we don't need 613 commandments. One would have done the trick and would have accomplished the same end. And that is what the Midrash states in text number 6, the variety of mitzvot. Was somebody pleased to read? Just unmute, otherwise we can't hear you.
I'll do it.
Thank you.
The variety of mitzvot. God did not leave anything in the world without providing the people of Israel with the means of performing a mitzvah with it. A person proceeding to plough must heed. Do not plough with an ox and a donkey together. So, do not sow kilayim in your vineyard. Reap. When you reap your harvest in your field, leave any forgotten sheaves for the poor. Thresh. Do not muzzle an ox while it is threshing. Knead dough. From the first of your kneading bowl, separate some challah as a gift to the priest. Remove eggs from a nest. Send away the mother bird. Slaughter a wild animal or fowl. Cover its blood with soil. Plant a tree. Observe its olah by abstaining from its fruit for the first 3 years. Bury a deceased relative. Do not mourn excessively by slashing yourself in grief. Take a haircut. Do not shave the corners of your head. Build a house. Install a safety fence around its roof and inscribe these words on the doorpost of your home and on your city gates. Wear a garment that has 4 corners. They shall make for themselves tzitzit.
And that, by the way, is just a shorthand of all the mitzvot, because the truth of the matter is you can't walk 4 paces without bumping into another mitzvah. It used to drive my mother mad. What are you mumbling for again? Mumble, mumble, mumble. Every few minutes you're mumbling away. There's another mitzvah, another bracha. It can drive you absolutely scatty. Why? Because it's the process of engaging with the world and sensitizing, refining oneself, refining one's emotions, one's sensitivities, refining the world itself, drawing out its innate spirituality, elevating every part of the physical material world with which you come into contact, revealing its internal, its inner godliness, touching everything with not the Midas touch to turn it to gold, but to turn it into holiness, into something which is sanctified, something which is beautiful, something which reflects the existence of the Creator and the world. So to summarize, here it is, and it's also, if you want to see it in your booklets, on page 108 in figure 3.1. There are the 2 ways of performing, the 2 purposes of a mitzvah. One is its general purpose, in which there is a common denominator between every commandment, and there is the specific purpose, which requires a variety of commandments throughout our activities in the world. Well, okay, that's all very well. So each mitzvah transforms a piece of the world with which it is engaged, turning it into a home for God, a place where His presence is unrestrained, unrestricted, expressed, manifest. But how does it transform the entirety of creation? Because after all, only a very small fraction of the world's resources partake in in mitzvah actions. What percentage of the world's GNP is donated to charity? What percentage of the world's animal hides are turned into parchment for our holy scrolls? And in our lives, what percentage of our brain power is utilized to study Torah? Of the 24 hours of our day, how many are we actually doing mitzvot? So this leaves a question about, all very well that you've got a nation who are considered to call the smallest nation in the world, of whom a proportion are running around doing mitzvot and touching whatever they can to sanctify it, to hallow it, to bring godliness into it. But you're only touching the smallest possible fraction of the whole world. Or are you? The truth of the matter is that every act that we do is the product of many, many, many other actions. Every resource that we utilize for the performance of a mitzvah is the end of countless other resources. This, by the way, is one of the most mind-blowing insights of the modern world in which we live, and we're going to demonstrate it with a video.
Muster an army of workers, machines, factories, ships, trains, and endless natural supplies. What do you get? A pencil. In 1958, Leonard Read penned a classic to document the mind-boggling diversity of materials and skilled labors required for a single manufactured object. He detailed the production of a pencil, speaking in the pencil's voice. My family tree begins with a cedar of straight grain. Contemplate all the saws and trucks and rope and the countless other gear used in harvesting and carting the cedar logs to the railroad siding. Think of all the persons and the numberless skills that went into the fabrication of these logging tools. The mining of ore, the making of steel and its refinement into saws, axes, motors, the growing of hemp and bringing it through all the stages of heavy and strong rope. Reed describes railroad networks and communication systems that bring the logs to mills, and the millwork that produces thin slabs. He asks, how many skills went into supplying the heat, the light and power, the belts, motors, and all the other things a mill requires? Reed includes the workers who constructed the hydro plant that supplies the mill's power, trains that transport the slabs, a factory that cost millions to erect and equip with brilliant machines that slit the slats and insert the lead, and the lead itself, produced by mixing graphite mined in Sri Lanka with clay from Mississippi and treating it with Mexican wax. The pencils receive 6 coats of lacquer and are labeled with carbon black mixed with resins. An eraser holder made of zinc and copper is attached, and black nickel rings are added. Finally, the pencil's eraser is a rubber-like product made with Indonesian rapeseed oil, Italian pumice, sulfur chloride, vulcanizing and accelerating agents, and cadmium sulfide. One pencil, millions of dollars, to dozens of countries, thousands of miles. But we can add something radical that Reed never considered. What if this pencil belongs to David, who uses it for Torah classes? It helps him observe the mitzvah of Torah study. That changes everything. Divinity, generated by his mitzvah, illuminates his soul and body, and elevates the pencil as well. That powerful godly light travels back along the pencil's production route, elevating the factory, railroads, minerals, investments, skills, lives, and all that Reed so vividly described. Think about that the next time you offer charity. Light a Shabbat candle, or wind tefillin around your arm. With each mitzvah act, so much of this world is connected with divinity.
Well, tomorrow morning, when you sit at your breakfast table, have a think about what happened to bring your muesli into the bowl in front of you. It is truly mind-blowing. By the way, there's a story about, it's called the Minnesota sandwich. I'll read it to you. A Minnesota native, Andy George, in 2015, set out to make a sandwich from scratch. He raised the vegetables and the wheat to make bread, harvested milk, eggs, honey, oil, and chicken, and he put it all together to make a finished sandwich. He even took a plane flight to the ocean to collect seawater that he used to make salt, and he built a press to extract oil from sunflower seeds to make mayonnaise. He documented the process, and he turned it into a YouTube series titled How to Make a $1,500 Sandwich in Only 6 Months. Let me bring myself back onto the screen. The same is true with every action that we do, with every object that we use to do it, especially in the interconnected world, the global world in which we live today. The textbook that you're holding in your hand may have been printed in China, transported on a ship built in Holland. The software with which it was designed may have been developed in California, and the person who did the layout might have trained in a school in Australia. The fact that we're sitting here today and learning about the concept of Mashiach is the product of thousands or possibly even millions of actions. That is really mind-blowing. At least I find it so. And in this way, every mitzvah action brings the entire world one step closer to making the world a home for God and bringing the world to a state of absolute goodness and perfection. Remember the exercise we did at the beginning of the class? The one that was on page 132, exercise 3.1. Now we're ready to take a second look at what we wrote or noted and to look at it again. The question at that time was, why do you do a mitzvah? And there were 8 possible answers that were suggested and the possibility of others as well. Well now, how would we answer the question after what we have learnt tonight? First of all, we could answer all of the above. Or we could give a different answer, which basically also says all of the above. And that answer would be, because whatever you do on that list, by virtue of the fact that you're doing a mitzvah, in the process, you're bringing Mashiach closer. I want to talk about another idea that builds on this. The idea of being partners in this process. Because when we do this work of refining the world and bringing it to perfection, in some sense we always speak about being partners with God in the work of creation. That's an idea which is based upon a number of sayings by the sages. One of them is in text number 7 on page 110. It's a very short text, and so I shall read it. The Torah considers those who recite the passage of Vayachulu during the eve of Shabbat prayers as if they have become partners with God in the work of creation. This is a passage which is recited. It's a passage that is actually part of Kiddush, Vayachul Hashemayim v'aretz v'chol tzava'am, Vayachal Elokim et Yom HaShvi, Shabbat, etc. We recite it in the Friday night service, and the custom is that we recite it together. You find a companion to recite it with. And as we recite in the Friday night service the passage about the creation of the world and that God rests in the Shabbat, in some sense, says the Talmud, we're becoming partners with God in the act of creation. So this idea of partner is one which we need to understand better. What does it mean to be a partner? So once again, a thought experiment. Imagine 2 people working in a business. One is an employee and the other is a partner. Now, by the way, I don't mean a partner in regard to ownership of the business. It's not that kind of partner. Both of these people are workers, but one has an employee attitude and the other one has a partner attitude. What's the difference between them? So to a casual observer, you may not see any difference. They're both doing exactly the same thing. Both of them are standing behind the counter serving customers. But if you look more closely, you'll notice some very subtle and perhaps some not so subtle differences about how these 2 people go about their jobs. Let's take a little small company, for example, Apple. That's a good example of a small company. Okay. Tens of thousands of employees. They include software developers, engineers, assembly line workers, salespeople, managers, PR people, accountants, secretaries, security guards, drivers, maintenance people. They even have a special section who specialize in hype. And you'll know them immediately anytime you watch one of their presentations. And each one of these workers knows that they have a specific job to do. Do they all have to know what the purpose of the company is, why it was founded, what it wants to achieve? Perhaps theoretically they could do their jobs without knowing what the company is about. Yet every company wants every employee to be aware of its overall purpose. And that is why every company has a mission statement, which they circulate among the employees, and they're printed in their literature, and they're on seminars on it. And this is to do with a very fundamental reason, because they understand that when an employee knows and is motivated by and is dedicated to the company's mission statement, this will express itself in many large and small ways in how they perform their job. And by analogy, we could all do things that we are commanded to do without even knowing why we are doing them. Perhaps it's just enough to know that God commanded us to do the mitzvot and to fulfill them. Maybe we don't need to know what the objective of all these actions are. Maybe, in this respect, a question which Lawrence Gold asked on the very first session, we're no different to workers. Just do your job and eventually things will happen. On the other hand, if we understand that the Messianic era is more than the hope and promise that one day things will get better, and that it is indeed the very purpose of creation, and it defines everything that we do and why we do it, then we become motivated participants in the project. We become partners in the enterprise to help it make it happen. On page 112, we have text number 8, just following orders. Someone be pleased to read it.
I'll read it, Shlomo.
Thank you so much.
Just following orders. A Jew can argue, practically, why is it important for me to know that the redemption will arrive someday? I need to do my work and fulfill that which God instructs me to do. It is not my business to know or be concerned with the greater objectives and the results of my service. The fallacy of this approach should be self-understood, but here is an illustration. Imagine a soldier in the midst of battle, standing up and saying, "It's not my business to know why my commanding officer gave me an order to fire my weapon. All that is important is that I meticulously follow the orders handed down by the chain of command. The fact that my actions impact the outcome of the battle, causing the enemy to retreat and bringing my side closer to victory, is irrelevant to me. I just need to shoot my rifle." This soldier, even if he dutifully executes every order he is given, will lack morale and passion. Moreover, without a doubt, to one degree or another, it will negatively impact his performance on the battlefield. The same is true regarding our service of God through Torah and mitzvah observance. We cannot claim that it is not our concern whether or not our service affects the long-awaited victory. We must know that there is a campaign underway and that it is our mission to bring it to its successful conclusion. We must be keenly aware of the reality that with each additional mitzvah, we reveal more godliness in this world, thereby moving a step closer to the ultimate triumph.
Well, hooray, at last we have a text that we can actually understand. Written by one of the leading Hasidim, extraordinary man, followers of the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory. So the first distinction between an employee and a partner is that one is focused and driven by the company's goal. You'll see this in the next slide, or you can see it in figure 3.2 on page 114. It's exactly the same. Job description for the employee, and the partner has a mission statement. They are motivated. But there's another second marked difference between an employee mentality and a partner mentality. The employee does their job and is compensated for the work, and that's the reward model. The partner, on the other hand, is motivated and driven by the results of their effort. Do you remember the distinction between reward and results? The partner is personally invested in the goal of the enterprise, regards each thing they do as something which furthers the goal. You see, the problem is that the common perception of religion is that it's just a list of do's and don'ts, and we follow them because the boss commanded them. Or perhaps in a more sophisticated attitude, it's because we recognize that it's going to improve the quality of our lives in some way. It's going to make us happier or more spiritual or some other benefit. The common denominator, it is basically a cost-gain dynamic. But that's not what religion should really be about. Text number 9 on page 114, and it is short, so I shall read it to you again. Antigonus of Socho received the tradition, this is from the Ethics of the Fathers, from Shimon the Righteous, and he would say, "Do not be as servants who serve their master for the sake of reward. Rather be as servants who serve their master not for the sake of reward." Because Judaism is not about reward, it's about a relationship. It's about a relationship with God. It's a partnership. A partnership with God in the work of creation. To be a partner means to assume ownership of the goals and the objectives of the partnership. My engagement with religion is not just for personal benefit, whatever side benefits there may or may not be. My engagement with religion as a partner with God is to further the goal and the purpose of creation as He set it forth. That is what my life is about as a Jew. It's a different mindset. And so here's our second distinction between the employee who's looking for reward and the partner who is focused on the result. And this brings us therefore to a third and final feature of difference between the partner mentality and the employee mentality. It's something about confidence in the success of the enterprise. When we saw last week Maimonides' formulation of the 13 principles of Judaism, belief in Mashiach, as you know, was listed in that list of 13, the big 13, on par with such fundamental principles as belief in God or the divinity of the Torah. But there is something that is unique about the belief in Mashiach that we do not find with any of the other foundational beliefs. We're going to look at 3 texts. Text 10a, text 10b, and text 10c on page 116, following through to 117. They are all relatively short, and it's best if one person reads through all of them, please. Starting with text number 10a. These are all taken from Maimonides in his discussion about the Messianic age. Who is our volunteer this time? Thank you so much.
The 12th foundation of Jewish belief is the era of Mashiach. That is, to believe and affirm that he will come, and not to think that he will be delayed. In the words of the prophet Habakkuk, if he tarries, expectantly await him. Anyone who does not believe in Mashiach, or does not expectantly await his coming, denies not only the other prophets, but also the Torah and our teacher Moses. I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Mashiach, and though he may tarry, I expectantly await his coming each day.
Thank you, Robbie. The common theme in these 3 texts is that it is fundamental in Judaism not only to believe that the Mashiach will eventually come, but to anticipate his coming every day. That is what is not present in any of the other foundational beliefs. The implication is that a person who believes that the Mashiach will come someday, but doesn't expect and anticipate that it will happen today, is, according to Maimonides, lacking something fundamental in what Judaism is about. To believe and affirm Mashiach will come and to not think that he will be delayed is part of what he says. And this is the significance between a really fascinating story that is told in the Talmud, in text number 11 on page 119. I'll read it to you. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi met with Elijah the prophet and asked him the crunch question: when will Mashiach come? Elijah responded, well, go and ask him. Where is he located? Asks Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. At the gateway of the city of Rome, responds the Mashiach. Well, there are a lot of people at the gateway of the city of Rome. How will I recognize him? He is sitting among the poor who suffer from illnesses. All the others untie all their bandages at once, and then they rebandage all their wounds together, whereas he unties and rebandages each wound separately, thinking, perhaps I will be needed immediately to bring the redemption, and I must not be delayed. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi went to him and greeted him. Peace be upon you, my master and teacher, he says to the Mashiach. Mashiach responded, peace upon you, son of Levi. Master, when will you come? Answers the Mashiach, today. Rabbi Yeshua, the following day, comes back to Elijah with a complaint. He lied to me. He told me he's coming today, and he didn't come. Elijah responded, this is what he told you. Today, if you will listen to his voice. Taken from the book of Psalms. In this story, Mashiach wants to impress on Rabbi Yeshua, and of course on us, that the only true answer to the question, when is Mashiach coming, is, and always was, today. It's only that if in retrospect, if Mashiach doesn't come today, that we resort to the explanation that something went wrong and we still need to do more to listen to God's voice. This is an extraordinary story. This level of expectation that it could happen today. But one has to ask, is it realistic? Is that a realistic expectation, for goodness sake, when you wake up and you look out at the world and you know the state that it's in? To imagine that Mashiach could come today, or at least that is what my total expectation should be, truthfully within myself. It's one thing to believe that something will happen despite the fact that it seems improbable in the current circumstances. That's, after all, faith. But it's quite another to expect it to happen immediately. So in Lesson 1, we saw how many of the messianic prophecies are actually being fulfilled. Jews believed intensely in Mashiach even before these signs could be visibly seen the way they are today, because they had belief. And furthermore, notwithstanding all the progress that we've made, as you know, we still have a way to go before we can attain a perfect world as described by the prophets. So to expect Mashiach to come today just doesn't seem very realistic. And yet we say that the expectation that the messianic reality will be immediately realized, says Maimonides, immediately realized, is the foundation of Judaism. How on earth can one achieve this kind of belief? Well, in some sense, this too is part of partner mentality. Because the true mark of a partner, over and above a focus on the result of his or her efforts, as opposed to just doing the job, is their belief in the success of the enterprise that they're engaged in. For us as Jews, believing Jews, there can be no doubt about the arrival of the Messianic age whenever it will occur. It's not a goal that may or may not be realized. This is the purpose for which God created the world, and it's inconceivable that God's purpose in creation will not be fulfilled, that the prophecies of his prophets will not come to fruition. If you are a believer, that is what you have to believe in. If one has a firm belief in the successful outcome of the enterprise, then it becomes easier to anticipate that it could happen at any time, even today, however unlikely the external signs might be. The point about external signs is very important. You see, remember our piano. Let's come back to it for a moment. There was a question of surface reality, and there was a question of an inner truth. Which of the three parallel universes, ours, the one without music, or the woodpeckers, is the real one? We defined our world as one in which God is concealed. So in effect, we are acknowledging that there are two parallel realities, a surface reality and an inner reality. The surface reality of our world is the flawed, imperfect, chaotic, and deficient world that we've been grappling with for the whole of human history. The inner truth of our world is the perfect home for God that he envisioned when he created the world, the Spirit of God hovering over the universe at the time of creation, that has constituted its very inner essence from the very beginning, beneath the surface. And if we can just get our heads around the realization that this inner truth of the universe is far more real than the surface reality that our senses present to us, then with that paradigm shift of thinking, Mashiach no longer becomes just a utopian dream. All that needs to happen is for a person to sit down at the piece of wood and start playing the piano. Text number 12 on page 122. From Rabbi Yaakov Sikili, a famous Kabbalist. The Torah states that the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the water, referring to the soul of the Mashiach. And this informs us that the soul of Mashiach has been standing at the ready ever since the 6 days of creation. It hovers over the waters, held back only until we return to God, as it is stated in the passage that we just read from that famous Medrash. Today, if you will listen to his voice, quoting from the book of Psalms. And so here's our third distinction between the worker and the employee, both of whom again are workers. The employee doesn't need to believe in the company's success, but the partner is certain of the success of the enterprise. Well, I want to tell you that there is a question that hangs over this lesson very heavily. In fact, it's a question which hangs over this entire course, and I want to address it now. There have been religious Jews for centuries who believed in the coming of the Mashiach and in the Messianic age. Many great sages, even in recent times, Chafetz Chaim was one, kept a He kept a suitcase packed ready for the arrival of the Mashiach, so he shouldn't lose any time getting to prime position Herzliya before everyone else got there. Fervently believed in all of these sages, all of these Jews. They believed in and prayed for the imminent coming of the Mashiach. And there were times in previous centuries where the fervor became boiled over and was so great that it led to moments of messianic fervor, and it culminated in the famous false messiahs, which were very painful episodes in our Jewish history. Shabtai Tzvi being the most famous. But the point is that the Mashiach, the whole Mashiach shtick, the whole Mashiach business, the whole thing has never been on the agenda in quite the same way as it is now until the arrival of the Lubavitch movement, and particularly its most recent leadership. That's the elephant in the room that's been present all the time. It's not in the course, by the way. It's my contribution to it, so to speak. Something which I wanted to add, because it is so obvious. One of our members at an earlier stage asked him if he was going to join a JLI course, and he said, well, it's Chabad propaganda. It's not for me. And, of course, it's all about Mashiach. So why did it become such a big thing in this particularly in this last generation with the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory? Well, one reason is because the whole task of Chabad Chassidut from its very outset, the mandate that was passed on by the Baal Shem Tov to the founder of the Chabad movement, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, whose teachings are the ones we've been studying in the book of Tanya, the whole mandate was to begin to reveal and to make explicit the hidden teachings of the Kabbalah in a language which will become accessible to all. And those teachings, of course, include the inner story of the Messianic age that we're studying here tonight. And this process was continued and expanded on by his successors, culminating in the teachings of the last Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory. And incidentally, and this is a whole bigger topic in its own right, its own course in its own right, this process of spiritual revelation that began with the Baal Shem Tov in the 18th century, the permission to begin to reveal the inner secrets of the Torah to the Jewish public and to the world, coincided with the time of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of our modern age, that began this process of advancement in the physical world that has accelerated so exponentially from that time onwards, and that we witness to this day. Because as the progress of the material world exploded, so too at the same time the revelations of the spiritual worlds had to be exposed. Body and soul always have to go hand in hand. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe not only imbibed these teachings, he lived them. He said from his earliest years, from the very time that he was conscious, he knew that this was his life's task. And at his very great spiritual level of refinement, for him, Mashiach was a reality. You could sense his enormous frustration that others simply couldn't see what he saw, couldn't feel what he felt. He lived with that inner reality, not the superficial one that we live with. And that brings us to his own statement in text number 13 on page 125, Dream versus Reality. And I shall read it. We have been discussing the redemption in the era of Mashiach. Some in the audience are genuinely astounded at this, although for obvious reasons they don't openly voice their amazement. How can an individual appear in public week after week and repeatedly and unceasingly discuss a single subject, the coming of Mashiach. And moreover, this individual, he's talking about himself, the Rebbe never used the word I. It wasn't in his vocabulary. There was no I. This individual emphasizes that he's not merely discussing the published Torah materials on this topic. Rather, he's discussing our righteous Mashiach's actual coming in our tangible reality here on physical earth, and immediately on this very day, Shabbat Parshat Pinchas 5744. And this individual further instructs others to sing on each and every occasion, Shir Baneh Beit HaMikdash, may the holy temple be rebuilt speedily in our days. And he points out that speedily in our days does not refer to the very near future. It means quite literally speedily today. Certainly every Jew believes that Mashiach can come at any moment, in keeping with one of the fundamentals of Jewish faith that states, I await his coming every day, Maimonides, that we've read. Nevertheless, they wonder, how is it justifiable to discuss this topic without let-up, and to emphasize on each occasion that Mashiach can come at that very moment? Is it not rather challenging to expect people to relate to Mashiach's imminence as if it were a tangible fact of our reality? So why does this individual speak incessantly about this on every occasion and with such single-minded intensity, as if to forcefully ram the idea into the minds of his listeners? This is the Rebbe speaking about himself. Their conclusion is that all this is a beautiful dream, and as we recite in our prayers, may all our dreams be positively fulfilled for me and for all Israel. Nice, but not realistic. If so, they claim, there's truly no point in discussing one's dreams at such length and with such frequency. The truth, however, is precisely the opposite. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi delivered a discourse based on the verse, when God returns the exiles of Israel, we shall be as those who have dreamed. He explained that our current state of exile is comparable to a dream, because in a dream, one's sense of perception can tolerate the most contradictory and irrational things. In other words, our current reality is a dream, whereas the world of Mashiach is our true reality. In a single moment, the situation can be reversed from one extreme to the other. We can awaken from the dream of exile and enter the true reality, the actual state of redemption. And so, each and every individual present in this room, of whom there were probably in excess of 5,000 when he was speaking his words, has the ability to make the redemption come immediately, not tomorrow or in the near future, but right now, on this Shabbat Parshat Pinchas 5744, before we even have a chance to recite the afternoon prayers. Simply stated, at this very moment, we open our eyes and we see Mashiach in the flesh with us here in the room. My goodness me, what an incredibly powerful conviction. What a demand that he made of all of us. The disturbing and disquieting question that we have to ask ourselves at the end of tonight's lesson is, who is dreaming? Those who believe in the possibility of a utopian world, or we who blunder around in a sleepwalking state, unable to see, sense, feel, or even imagine the true underlying reality? Who are the dreamers? Them or us? Here's our summary video for tonight.
Lesson 3. Superhuman versus superhumans. 1. The purpose of creation, according to Hasidic teachings, is God's desire for a home in our material world and corporeal reality. 2. The physical world is referred to as the lowly world because it obscures the truth that God pervades every aspect of existence. Making the world a home for God means to penetrate this concealment and transform physical reality into a place that expresses the divine goodness and perfection. 3. The Messianic world is not only a reward for doing mitzvot, but is the actual result of these actions. A mitzvah transforms the object with which it is performed from a self-defined existence into an instrument of God's will. In addition, each mitzvah makes a particular part of the world more receptive to spirituality, bringing it one step closer to expressing the divine goodness and perfection. 4. The mitzvot directly engage with only a small percentage of the physical universe and of each individual life, but each mitzvah action is the product of countless other actions and processes. In this way, the whole of creation is ultimately transformed. 5. The sages teach us that by doing mitzvot, we become a partner with God in the work of creation. There are a number of distinctions between a partner mentality and an employee mentality. A. An employee is driven primarily by his or her job description, whereas for the partner, the company's mission statement is the driving force. An employee is motivated by reward, whereas a partner is results-driven. C. A partner is confident of the success of the enterprise. 6. The 12th foundation of Judaism, by Maimonides' count, is not only the belief that Mashiach will come, but also the daily anticipation of the redemption. When we understand that the true nature of reality is the divine goodness and perfection, the expectation of Mashiach's imminent coming is more realistic than the concealment that obscures this truth.
Well, there you are. What would you like to say about that?